The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see...
We still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. Txgen Meyer is a writer and critical theorist living in California, and she participated in a panel discussion that was billed as a struggle session aimed at me. It took place during an anti-Jordan Peterson conference in Boise, Idaho last year, and was deemed to be necessary due to a Zero Books video entitled Intersectionality, Queer Eye, and the Good Place that was published in October of last year. Txgen was on the panel representing a trans, black, queer perspective and was also the voice of reason. She is the guest this week as we discuss her essay, Networked Ressentiment, on anti-Blackness and white terrorism. It's Sunday, June 2nd, 2019, and I'm Douglas Lane, the publisher of Zero Books and the host of this podcast. This week's podcast is out rather late due to the editing that was required for the first episode of a new YouTube series we're producing entitled We Live in a Society, and I'll put a link to that video in the show notes here. Right now, the music you're listening to is entitled Electronic Melodic. It's from Storyblocks, which is a stock footage, audio, and video website. But in just a moment, you'll be listening to Txgen and I discuss anti-Blackness, essentialism, and idealism. Txgen Meyer is a writer and critical theorist living in California. She was on the panel that last year that was billed as a struggle session when I was in Boise, Idaho. But she was the one panelist who then went out drinking with a few of us afterwards. So Txgen, welcome to the Zero Books podcast.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Last year when we met up, I had been subjected to this struggle session that was sort of billed as a struggle session as a jest and then almost turned into one, I think. So I guess before we start in on the piece that you wrote, because you wrote an interesting piece called Networked Ressentiment. At least that's one title that I saw on it, although there were so many different sections. You could call it whatever you like. But let's talk a little bit about that. What did you think of that panel that we were on together? Back in October, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, well, one interesting thing to think about is just the context of that panel in general, right? To my knowledge, it was planned that weekend. A lot of the panel members were really unaware of what we were there for. I know for me, it was framed as being a struggle session based off of a video that you made. And for me, it was the first time seeing that video. I know Dave or Lisa, whatever they go by nowadays, had invited me like the night before to serve on a panel. I was like, okay, I guess I'll take that opportunity.
It seems like you were invited, and tell me if this is wrong, but it seems like the reason you were invited was because you are a Black trans woman.
Yeah. Effectively, I'm Afro-Latina. I think that played probably the biggest role. And also, I think I was the only, at least like openly queer person on the panel. So.
Right. And so it was important to, in a critique of a video about intersectionality, to have a panel that was intersectional.
Yeah, I get that to some extent. Though I think that my sort of lack of preparedness probably wasn't the best, especially given like the rushed nature of it.
Well, yeah, it was originally put together as a confrontation between myself and Peter Coffin.
Yeah.
And not, so because he had gone after me on Twitter, and, in a way that I thought was disingenuous, frankly. And so we were going to work it out. And then we talked at a bar, at one of these little, it was just an informal event, and we ran into each other. And in a sense, that after we talked privately, the need for the panel was had dissipated in my mind. But,
Yeah.
but it occurred anyway. And there were other people involved. But I kind of thought that panel was a disaster, not only because I didn't particularly like being put on the hot seat, and not actually the one thing that I would say that bothered me the most was not anything that anybody else did, but it was Derek Varn's participation. But we worked that out later. But it was just, I felt like we didn't do well at discussing that. No one did particularly well in that panel. That's what I would say. That everyone sort of turned into a stereotype of themselves.
I don't know what else we could have been, though, especially given the fact that, at least for me, it was the first time seeing that video.
Right. No, you were actually fine. Everyone on the panel, you were the least offensive, and because you were very honest. Oh, this is the first time I've seen it. I have to think about it. But anyway, so we've kind of covered that. It was a fine conversation, but now we're going to have another conversation where what I hope is that you can help me understand where you're coming from a little bit better than I do, and maybe vice versa. As a sort of class reductionist white guy. So let's talk about your piece. Tell me about this work. It's entitled Networked Ressentiment.
Yeah, Networked Ressentiment, if you will. Right. I guess I'll give a little bit of context about the
Is it going to be published? It has already been published?
It's going to be published in the first issue of a new journal called Cognitive Terrorism. And so they commissioned me to write this piece. And I've been playing around. As I think you acknowledge, the format is a bit peculiar, if you will, for... Yeah. And, being a Daluzagatarian, of course, I'm going to love, all of these breaks of flows. But I've been playing around with this concept that I like to call hyperzine, which is basically a way for me to integrate hypertext into theory. Guattari has this quote. He says that there should be hypertext in every genre. And so that's kind of the way that I'm going about actualizing hypertext through this really fractured approach to, I guess, the essay format. I began with this question of, how do we account for the events at Christchurch? Because when I was commissioned for this piece, that was sort of, I think that happened maybe a week or two after I was commissioned for this piece. So it was fresh on my mind, and I felt some need to account for the events that occurred. And something that I felt was missing from a lot of the discourse on the events that took place was the relationship between white supremacist, white nationalist terrorism and anti-Blackness. Because for me, the relationship there is intrinsic. Something I talk about at some length in this text is about Akil Mbembe's text, The Critique of Black Reason, right, where we find even in the introductory statements of the text that the foundation myth of European identity is that of anti-Blackness. And so in this text, I spend a lot of time here beginning side-by-side discussion of Mbembe's Critique of Black Reason and Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals.
Now, can I just interject and say, don't you think that European identity before whiteness was entirely different than it is under the banner of whiteness? Like there was, European identity was fractured along national and ethnic lines?
Absolutely. And I think that it's only accurate to date these things to a certain point of, possibly after the Industrial Revolution.
Right. Or, around the time of even if it's nascent days of the Industrial Revolution or before. Yeah, sure. So it was basically the slave trade that created a false European identity of unification around whiteness.
I think that the slave trade did play a large role in that. Though something that Mbembe brings up, and I tend to agree here, is that even before we had the trade of slaves, there had to have been some sort of how do I put this? Some sort of ontological impoverishment of the Black individual that took place in order for the slave trade to exist.
Why? And why ontological? Because that seems really racist to me, to say that not that people thought or came up with an ideology, but to say that they actually were in their being impoverished.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm not making this claim that they should be in their being impoverished, but that the fact of the matter was that Mbembe identifies sort of three movements that take place in the constitution of slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. Right? He says that first there's a separation of the Black individual from their self. That then there's a disappropriation of the Black individual, and then there is a degradation. And he identifies in this second movement, right, of disappropriation, he identifies here two simultaneous movements: one of material expropriation and one of ontological impoverishment.
What's the difference between the material and the ontological?
Yeah. Sorry. It's a big question. It's important. The difference.
Because it almost seems like you're saying ontological when you really mean something like epistemic. Like it's meaning the opposite. I mean, I don't really know. I mean, you tell me, but it almost seems like when the word ontological comes up, it almost means it's opposite. It almost means like there's an ideology of Black impoverishment. It almost seems like I wonder if ontology is referring to something other than material reality in this. It's like what maybe what's being assumed here is that the ground or substance of reality isn't matter, but some sort of essence or ideal.
I think, yeah, this does at some point boil down to the question of like a materialism versus idealism, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm just going right to it. And this is what my problem has been with Deleuze, especially with his embrace of Spinoza. And it really has nothing from, and I know I'm not politic to say, but for me, like my troubles are all about like these old philosophical questions more than they are about like a political aim. Like, like the political aim of liberating or emancipating Black people in the world is an aim I share, but the Deleuzian take is maybe some part that I don't accept, Yeah,
no.
So, but I'm not sure I can make that break. If that's a fair way of splitting like maybe I can't actually be for Black emancipation unless I embrace Deleuze. So, I mean, I'm willing to grant that that's a possibility. So, I'll let you.
I guess having a little bit of time to just process things here. With regards to this sort of material expropriation, I think we are dealing with the realm of, and this is something that we touched on very briefly in our conversation during the panel, but I think with regards to this material expropriation, we are dealing with the production of commodities. We're dealing with the production, the role of the Black individual in the production of commodities. However, I'm going to make the claim, and I know that you'll likely disagree with me, that there are other productions which take place, right? There are social productions, there are desiring productions, there are all of these different ranges of productions which in some ways escape the economic.
Right. So this is where I think I have a problem, as people want to call me an economic reductionist, not because I don't believe these other realms of production exist. I just don't think that in the last instance, they don't escape the realm of material production, which are what we might call now under capitalism, the economic. I mean, it's not always been economic. So I feel as though these days, nothing really escapes the realm of the economic, and that's what we're trying to escape. That's what we want to change, is to be, because if we were materially free, if we didn't have to work to survive, the problems of ideology would be very different. The problems of identity would be very different. It would be these problems would be worked out amongst basically free and materially, let's just call it equal. It wouldn't be exactly equal individuals. And the reason I say let's call it equal is because the rule under communism would be from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. So the question of equality would almost not even appear in that kind of communist utopian vision, right? But I feel as though the questions of race and ethnicity that we understand now are in the last instance determined by economic and material realities in the world, rather than only by cultural or ideological realities. And I don't feel like I'm being very controversial to say that, but I'll let you respond.
Forgive me if this isn't a direct response, but it's what my heart tells me to say. What I want to really highlight in this ontological impoverishment is what I do believe we can speak of, and what Mbembe brings up are three different movements, three different ways in which the Black individual is considered a non-human, and how the relationship between the Black individual and the white individual is to be reconciled in some way, right? How could we speak of some type of equality? He quotes Tocqueville in saying that Negroes and whites must either blend entirely or separate. And so we deal with this question of how could we respond to this, right? He says in the first response there is that the experience of the Black individual should be considered one of pure difference, and a difference which is understood as being a lack, so a lack of humanity, right? The second answer that we can give is that the Black individual should be understood as a difference with substance. And then the third is that the Black individual should assimilate in some way, that there should be some sort of training, some sort of educational process.
Now, this is all what's happening inside the white imagination for the most part. I mean, I'm going to say totally. That's what he's describing is what's happening inside the white imagination.
Yes, yeah. What he calls what is it? I think it's the Black consciousness of white, or of European subjectivity, something along those lines. He calls it.
Oh, okay, so it's what the Black consciousness understands of itself through the lens of white subjectivity.
Yes.
Right. So, but is there not a Black subjectivity that doesn't rely on whiteness?
There is, and that's the whole point of this text, right? He says that Black reason is two things. Black reason is first that what we were just talking about, the Black subjectivity understood through the lens of Western or Black consciousness understood through the lens of white subjectivity, and I think he calls it like a Black consciousness of Blackness.
Now, so my question is that consciousness going to be something like universal reason, or is it going to be something that tries to escape from the finitude of reason, like tries to be substance itself?
Yeah, and I think that ultimately it is something that tries to escape
from reason and be something like a spiritual substance, almost an intuition. In the words of one of my favorite former professors, Shataru Matawa, say more. Just that in order to, so if you escape from reason and the kind of finite approach of reason, which is one in which you understand that your conceptions of the world are never going to be identical with the world as it is in itself, that there's always a bit of an imposition of reason onto the world because of the difference between the conceptions and the world as it is. If you escape from that relationship, then what your claims to knowledge will amount to something like assertions, and you want to justify those assertions, and you're going to justify them through the assertions either not being different from what they're asserting, so they are themselves a substance, in which case they're at that point, I think you really do move into an immaterialist conception of the world. They're like an incantation of reality. Or if not that, if there's still a material world, then there's something where the material world is understood through a process that is immediate or intuitive. And I would say that intuition is the word that best describes that. Yeah. I want to give you an easy answer. There's no easy answer. I mean, this is a hard one, but I'm just sort of like, I'm just sort of making my best case, and it's one that I make a lot. Yeah. About all manner of like, what I consider to be like Nietzschean approaches to reason that maybe you can find in Derrida, you can find in Foucault, you can find in a lot of post-structuralist thought, and that I believe, is a kind of a one-sided, in the final analysis, return to intuition over reason, because reason is supposed to be totalizing. I mean, there's this critique of reason. Right. I mean, you can find it in Kant, the critique of pure reason. Right. But I have this Hegelian move that I try to make. It's my understanding of Hegel is like to say, oh, no, actually, what's totalizing is intuition. And reason is always, because it's a process of becoming, is less totalizing because reason, the ultimate absolute understanding of reason is it's self-understanding of its own error, its unavoidable error. So, and because it isn't identical with what it's the object of its own understanding. So that's, but I would hardly identify that with whiteness. Right? Because I would identify that with, Hegel, but not with whiteness overall. And I would certainly say there's plenty of white mystics out there in the world. And those are the people I trust the least. But anyway, I'll back off of this because I feel like we can come back to this kind of big philosophical question. Can I raise a different objection to? Feel free. The thrust of it. Here it go. Okay, here it is. I'm a little concerned about the focus on terrorism as such, when it comes to white supremacy, because I feel as though that leaves out, not intentionally, and it's trying to be worked back in, but it leaves out the fact that by tying in whiteness to the slave trade and to the economic, you're going to show how white supremacy is part of the mainstream. But when you talk about terrorism, you're always talking about this sort of excessive, criminal, individualized, particular reaction. And so, like, for me, like, the critique of the war on terror was to say, no, we've got to understand terrorism as a Islamic terrorism, the supposed terrorism of the other, as a symptom of the world that is being produced by American power, but also the economic realm and the inequalities and uneven development of the world. And that these ideological reactions, like, say, radical Islamic fascism or whatever, that is not where we want to look first in order to try to explain acts of terror. That is a culturalist and ultimately kind of bigoted approach to understanding. That's like the Sam Harris of the world approach to understanding terrorism. So I would want to be consistent and say, when it comes to white terrorism, that the real motivation for it is anti-Semitism, not anti-Blackness. And the reason why it's anti-Semitism is because it's sort of like the socialism of idiots. So you come up with an enemy who's representing all the contradictions of the system and is the ruler of the system. And that's not the black man, that's the Jew in ideological terms. So that I would think of white terrorism as motivated by anti-Semitism primarily. So anyway, I've shot my whole wad here. But go ahead. I'll let you respond to all of that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first to deal with just my focus on terrorism in this piece,
yeah.
Right? It was,
you were asked to do that. First of all, right?
Yeah, that was what was asked of me. That's what I was paid to do. I had 2,000 words. I spent 6 pages going through terrorism because that's what was asked of me. But I am developing these theses much further in a pamphlet that I'm actually commissioned to write. It's coming out next month. No, not next month, but the month after, in July. There I don't spend nearly as much time talking about terrorism, because I only did so because it was asked of me.
I want you to feel free to go after me now. Like, I've given you my best shots. You should feel free to give me your best shots. And at this point, what I want to do from this point on in the conversation is give you a chance to really lay out your argument as best you can, and so people can consider it without my objections. So, well,
I think what I sort of want to return to again is this question of, the primacy of I guess what today we might consider like economic production. For me, at least, I think that it is something of a reductionism to speak of things in the terms of like the economic base, the ideological superstructure. I think that we can only understand these productions in relation to one another insofar as they only exist because they are plugged into one another, right? Deleuze and Guattari described the mechanosphere, right? The sphere of all machines being plugged into all other machines. When I am, at least, sitting at my desk here reading or thinking to myself about anti-Blackness, that's something that I can't on my own conceptualize as being what I would say reduced to these economic productions. I think that when we are dealing with, when we're dealing with this question of taking control of the means of production, right? That being able to enact communist society through, from each according to their ability, from each according to their abilities to each according to their means, or yeah. when we're dealing with those things, that we must consider these non-economic productions, particularly as also needing to be taken control of. I think particularly got any names too that I agree wholeheartedly should in some ways take primacy, that of the production of subjectivity and the production of the socios. And he identifies those two as being two which should be considered right alongside the production of or I guess economic productions. When we're dealing with sorry, my brain's just jumping around, but when we're dealing with as you were saying, right, anti-Semitism being the sort of catalyst for white supremacist terrorism, what I argue, or what I at least attempt to argue in this text, and what I truthfully believe, is that we can only understand today and historically the constitution of the white individual as being in relation to the black individual. That it is the sort of foundational myth of whiteness to constitute blackness as its other. And for me, at least, and any sort of outrage or action to go against or to preserve the white individual, right? I think of this in the way that Nietzsche would speak of the slave revolt and morality, right? As being the resentful subject. And for me, it's a resent of the black individual. It's a resent of the black individual, particularly because I think that the black individual, as the non-human par excellence, sort of serves as the prime body by which the white individual comes to know themselves. This is something that I explore a lot in an interview I did recently with Juliana Huxtable, where we spent quite a lot of time talking here about, why do white men resent black women? And something I love what Juliana said. And she says that it's because the black woman makes evident for the white man everything about them that they may like have some sort of displeasure in, or everything that is not them, the black woman represents. And I think that we can only really, I may be repeating myself here, but we can only really start to grasp these acts of white violence through the lens of what are they protecting and who are they protecting it from, and for me they're not protecting it from the Jew but from the black individual.
Well, okay. I'm not going to. I've already given you my objection, so I'll just let you have the last word on that. Let's talk briefly about you as a person and your writing, because one of the things that I find amazing, and I know this is going to be a little bit ageist, but is that you're 19 and you write theory like someone who's at the very least in or come out of graduate school, it seems to me. So how long have you been writing critical theory, and how did you come to it?
Well, one thing I'll say before that, something that I was going to say earlier, but I didn't really find an opportunity to say, is that in thinking about my age, right, I'm reminded of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, Isidio Isu. He's the founder of the Letterists International, the organization which precedes the Situationist, right? He has a film, the Traité de Bave et d'Eternité, I think it is, right? The Treatise on Venom and Eternity, it's translated, but it's more like the Treatise on Spittle and Eternity, which is a much better title. Right, in this, he begins it by saying, he is only 24, 25 years old, and that, he cites all of these people who say that you need like 30 years for thought to develop. So please understand that his film is undeveloped. And I would ask the same for any listeners of me to understand, right? In my writings, I am 19.
Yeah, right. But nonetheless, I feel as though even if you and I have a disagreement about some pretty core philosophical concepts, that we're playing in the same sandbox, like we're and that you are coming into philosophy and critical theory guns blazing, and that you're doing it in not maybe a fully developed way, but in a substantial way, and you're having some success. You're finding publication at a young age, and you are developing. So how did you do that? When did you start writing? Philosophically,
I started writing for myself probably 3 years ago, when I was about 16. When I was really like the first like text I consider myself to have like wrote were texts I was writing for university, because I graduated high school at 16. So
okay.
You're
one of those.
Yeah.
One of those gifted and talented types.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what they called me. So I graduated high school at 16. I went to Willamette University, and I remember the first paper I wrote there was really the first paper I even tried writing something of importance about. And I wrote a paper on the relationship of I was taking a 300 level film studies course on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and my first paper got an A- on. It was about the relationship between the use of water in 1940s Israeli cinema and masculinity. That it was just something that I continue to this day to even think about. But I've just felt sort of as though I have some natural inclination to do these things. From there, I mean, before then, I'd already been reading Deleuze. I started reading like structuralist and post-structuralist theory when I was like 14, 15. Before that, I had been reading. I had a brief stint as a structural Marxist. I loved Althusser when I was like 13, 14.
When you were like 13, you loved Althusser? Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah.
You know what I loved when I was 13? Doctor Who, and when I
was like 13, 14, I was fascinated with Althusser, and I was actually through Althusser. I was talking with an instructor at a high school that I went to who did his PhD in cinema studies at NYU. He had brought up Hart and Legris to me when I told him that I was interested in Althusser. And from there, I started reading, and I was like, oh, who is this Deleuze person? Who is this Guattari person? And I remember reading, what was the first passage? I think the first passage of Guattari's I read was from the Anti-Oedipus papers. Not Anti-Oedipus, but a collection of works of Guattari's that was published sometime in the past 5 years. Of Guattari's journal entries and essays and notes that he had written, and letters that he had written around the time that Anti-Oedipus was published. I remember reading, there was one passage in particular that I just couldn't stop thinking about when I read. And it was a diary entry of Guattari's where he was talking about the dance of anxiety, like he called, where he just talked about his writing process. And I was like, wow, this like describes everything about my writing process that like I also struggle with. So let me see more about this. I was flipping through the book, and I find, passages where he starts to describe, there are only two politics, he says, right? Oedipal and revolutionary. And so, I had this sort of like, still being young, I was just looking for things that helped me understand myself in some way.
Unlike today, right? Back then when you were young. So when you were 13, 14, 15 and starting to get into critical theory, did this put a distance between yourself and your peers?
I mean, that distance had existed since elementary school. I mean, I've always been bullied as a kid, so I never had too close of a relationship with my peers. I was always close to my teachers than I was my peers.
Okay. So you didn't have friends who you aligned with who were also into critical theory or have a little you?
No. I mean, the first time I really had a friend who I could talk to about theory-related things was in ninth grade. I switched schools second semester of ninth grade because my mom kicked me out. Long story. And I had come to this new school, and in my English class, they were reading Antigone. Antigone, and I remember reading it and thinking, like, this is like a beautiful work of literature, right? And so I had found Judith Butler's text, Antigone's Claim, and I started.
See, there's where you went wrong.
And I remember I was reading that, and I went to my instructor, and she was like, "Oh, have you spoken to this other instructor on campus?" And I had never taken a class with him, so I had no reason to really speak to him. And he was the one who introduced me to like Heart Negri and Gatari, and he was like the first friend I really had that I could like talk to about these things with.
And it was an instructor.
Yeah, but he was a good friend. I would hang out with him after school while I was like grading papers, and we'd just like talk for like 2-3 hours every day after.
Right. I mean, and the thing that's nice to hear about that is that it does mean that good teachers, good instructors can really make a difference in kids' lives. Yeah. But then you got into college, or you're in college now, right? You're in university now?
I dropped out after a year.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So what happened to you? I mean, not to go too personal on this, but I am interested because you seem like you would be a natural fit for an academic environment. What did you find at university that wasn't working for you?
There were 3 things. One, every time I would go talk to a new professor whose work I was interested in or go hang out with someone, I would always be asked the question, "Why are you here?" And I didn't really understand that at the time. But I would be in, I took a seminar course on Duchamp for a semester. And I remember my instructor in like the second session of our class going like, "You're not doing undergraduate work. You're doing graduate level work on Duchamp. Like, why are you even like wasting your time?" And I had even had an interaction with one of the deans on campus who was like something of a friend of mine because I would go hang out with her all the time. And I was sitting in her office one day, and it just finally clicked with me. And she asked me the same question that so many other people on campus had asked me. And she was like, "Why are you really here?" And I had to admit, I'm here because, that my family told me this is the path that I should be going on. I'm here because, my grandmother is an academic and my mother is sort of as well. So, this just seems really like where I should be. But like, I quite frankly hated it. I felt like there were so many limitations on what I could do. There were so many ways in which I was like forced to act that I just didn't want to put up with.
Now, let me just see if I understand you correctly here. The instructors weren't being insulting. They were saying,
"No,
you should already be in graduate school."
Yeah, I had multiple instructors who were telling me like the papers I was trying to write for term papers were like graduate level work. And for me, that didn't mean anything at the time because I was like, "Oh, that's just like being here. Like school is school." But like I now like.
So was there a path forward for you to where you could get your undergraduate degree quickly and move on into graduate level work, or was it possible for you to take graduate level work while you were getting your BA or something like that?
Only to a very limited extent, and having to go through it, I would have had to have done a lot of bullshit courses that just like didn't matter to me. Like I was being forced to take stats, even though I'd taken 2 years of calc in high school. Like I didn't get that. I was like, put me in multivariable calculus, and so I was being forced to take all of these like courses that to me were like remedial. I'm like, why am I in this like basic statistics class? Like I should be in multivar. You know, why am I being forced to take all of these like 100?
Couldn't you test into those other classes though? I mean, didn't they have that capacity?
I would try to argue with my advisor about these things, but she would be like, no, just take the easy class because it'll be, you know, like, I guess better for you or whatever, like less stress.
You mean easy A. You get an easy A, you'll have a 4.0. And so, yeah, you'll be treading water, but your GPA will be stellar, and then you can go to any university you want for graduate school.
Yeah, and that was just sort of like what and maybe it was just an issue with my advisor, but that just sort of seemed to be the idea on campus for what students who excel do. It's just like, oh yeah, you're just like getting through this, and then you know you can pick whatever grad school you want. And you know, I don't really care for that, quite frankly. The first moment that I had where I was like, I like accepted I didn't need to be here was when I started private tutoring. I had started tutoring. My first student was a 26-year-old who didn't know I was 18 at the time until like 8 months into our tutorial. And I was doing tutorials over Google Hangouts, and I had started interacting more and networking more with people at like the New Center and with like Jaden Adams and that crew.
But see, my question is, you just as a practical, like I have kids that are older than you and are in university, so it's the paternal side of my personality is wondering, are you losing out on opportunities? I mean, it's because you're not going to have the degree, or are you going to find a way to get a degree that will match your interests so that you'll have more opportunities in the market of career?
Sometimes my goal, our goals are constantly changing, but sometimes my goal is like, oh, I can like apply to master's programs that don't actually have, because there are actually quite a few master's programs that don't necessitate a BA. That it's not considered a prerequisite. And
so it's like essay based in GRE or something like that?
Or, they do like holistic review. So it like your actual educational background isn't like what takes primacy. And I get that that's like a rule there for like people who might not like have done so well in the undergraduate. But like they do, some of them like explicitly say on their websites, like, we consider you if you don't have undergraduate degrees. And so, sometimes I think like, oh, maybe I'll apply like a master's program, get, my $20,000 a year and, I'll work through that for a few years and, get some degree. But, at the same time, like, I kind of like Tyler Creator put out a new album recently, and one of the lyrics on it is sometimes you have to close the door to open the window. I kind of like that sort of outlook on things right now. And, I'm young enough to where like whatever decision I make right now doesn't.
Yeah, no, it's not permanent. Damn you. All right. Well, no, listen. Okay. I feel like we've got enough almost here to make a podcast. I guess my question for you would be, when it comes to publishing, where would you see yourself as a writer? And do you find that do you have an ambition to be a popular writer as well as a writer of theory?
As far, I'll answer in reverse. As far as being a popular writer, I don't really know. Honestly, sometimes I know, especially right now, it'd be the very good like financial decision for me to choose to write for a more general audience instead of having my audience be like 12 dudes on Twitter. But oh geez. But as far as I guess writing for a more general audience, it's something I consider at times. And I probably, as I move forward, I'll probably find myself doing it, even if I'm not doing it like consciously. But as far as like publication goals, places I'd love to see my work in, I have sort of 3 goals right now for myself. I want to publish in Sternberg Press. I want to publish in eFlux, and I want to publish for Human Press. For their what is the name of that series? They have a series where they publish a text open access on their website. I forget what the series is called.
Are those all academic publishers?
eFlux not so much, but University of Minnesota definitely. And Sternberg it's distributed by MIT Press, so kind of. And I think Pelly told me that you need external funding to publish with them, so kind of.
Well, good luck. And when you have your first book, or if you have another essay you want to discuss, let me know, and I'd be glad to look it over and have you back on the podcast.
Yeah, definitely.
So this didn't go so badly, did it? This was fun?
No, not at all. This was really fun. I'm sorry I couldn't be more of a debater here. I mean,
no, it's fine.
I'm comfortable just being like, well, we have this disagreement, and
right. That's where I thought we should leave it too, because the fact is that for one of the other of us to convince each other of this would take I think months, not just 30 minutes.
We would have to have we would be doing public debates for
right. Sessions. And now hearing your background at the age of 13 reading out this era, I don't want to share a stage with you. You take me out. I don't want that.